Welcome to today's SeafoodNews.com video, sponsored by the Alaska Seafood Marketing Institute.
Good morning. It's Wednesday, June 19th. We want to comment today about the collapse of the attempt of the MSC certification of the Alaska salmon fisheries. This originated after over 80% of the Alaska processors withdrew from the MSC certification program at the end of the fishing year of 2012. Subsequently, the MSC and the Seattle-based Purse Seine Vessel Owners Association signed a client contract under which the Purse Seine group would sponsor an MSC assessment of Alaska salmon fisheries. The aim was to provide some continuity and make sure that at least for certain buyers, MSC certified salmon would be available from Alaska in the current fishing season. That effort has now collapsed. The certifier has announced that Prince William Sound will not be included in any certifications this year, and that they will start again with a certification process for Prince William Sound pink salmon in 2014. It's ironic that Prince William Sound pink salmon is the largest single volume fishery that is fished by the Purse Seine Vessel Owners Group, and is also one of the key items that's processed by Silver Bay, which was the lone processor who actively pushed to continue this MSC relationship. What this tells me is that there's a danger that the MSC process has gotten so complex and cumbersome that it is difficult to apply it to situations when new evidence and new science is coming along. There's a very legitimate issue about the role of hatchery fish and the interaction of hatchery fish with wild salmon runs. Hatcheries have been used around the North Pacific, both in Japan and Russia and Alaska, for over 100 years. And the idea of enhancing salmon runs by promoting survival of smolts is a well-established fisheries practice. However, there is a lack of information or a lack of substantive information about the impacts of intermixing of these hatchery-based salmon stocks and wild salmon stocks, and there are some issues about whether the production of hatchery fish, which raises the total numbers of fish, is leading to some sort of adverse competition with wild fish stocks. Whether this is happening or not is extremely mixed. There's no clear evidence one way or the other, but it is something that is worth investigation. The reason the MSC certification Alaska collapsed was because the certifiers found they were outrunning the science. The managers in Alaska, who have a really prodigiously excellent track record on salmon, are spending about $5 million to initiate a full-fledged scientific better understanding of precisely these interactions of hatchery and wild fish, and to map where the fish runs in Alaska are dependent on hatchery fish, where they're dependent on wild fish, what the intermixing might be, what the impacts on the wild fish runs might be. And then they can make some regulations and some actual suggestions about improvements in hatchery management to mitigate any of these effects. But the MSC assessment floundered on this rock, and because they couldn't really address it, they decided just to punt the whole thing into the year 2014. At the same time, the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership has come out, which used to be a big supporter of Alaska salmon and the MSC, has come out with a report that said 49% of the salmon stocks in the Pacific were at risk in some way. The basis of their saying it's at risk is, again, their concern over hatcheries. Well, this is something that, as I said before, has been in place for 100 years. The proper approach here is to say, okay, let's try to define the problem. Let's all support some research and understand what the problem is, and then let's agree on what steps we can take to mitigate the problem if it exists. This is the normal way that people go about making improvements. But the MSC process and the SFP sort of scoring process seem to be getting ahead of this game and ending up with scoring things based on the worst potential fears of something that's happening rather than on any evidence that they have of something bad happening. And I think that's particularly egregious when salmon hatcheries have been in place for such a long time and have been such a traditional part of salmon fishing around the entire Pacific Rim. So that's why I think that this MSC process may have gotten too cumbersome, and that both the buyers and the global fisheries community are going to be well served by a benchmarking process such as taking place through GSSI that will establish what actually certification schemes have to address to be credible and to be useful in the marketplace. And there's really no need for a retailer to hire its own scientists, to develop its own institute, and to sort of supervise the professional scientists in Alaska, which is essentially what some of the NGOs are now asking them to do. In Lexington, Mass., this is John Sackton.
Today's SeafoodNews.com video was brought to you by the Alaska Seafood Marketing Institute. Alaska has been protecting wild and sustainable seafood for generations and adheres to the most recognized and internationally accepted set of guidelines written by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. For recipes and additional information, visit wildalaskaflavor.com.